I need some traction. You need some traction.
Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI, is on the mission to help innovators change the world by giving them access to government funding and all these resources they need to succeed. Today's session is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Founder Institute, Lazaridis Institute, BCF Ventures, and Growth Blazers. Today's topic is very hot, and I tell this to all founders. As a founder, your responsibility is to maximize your capital stack and not just anchor on one thing. I want to raise VC money. I want to look at debt, look at VC, look at angels, look at all the options. And one of the best options is crowdfunding. And, Nick is a pioneer in the crowdfunding space. You started it when it wasn't even a thing, man. Like you started it in 2011 when I think the word crowdfunding not many people even heard of that word. And you've democratized equity crowdfunding. You've raised equity crowdfunding. So I'm super excited. The government has increased the cap from 1 million to 5 million in how much money you can raise. So it's all around an interesting time. I think democratizing more and more equity dollars for founders is a great mission. It's our mission too, is enabling founders to become successful, innovators to become successful by democratizing access to capital. And today's session is going to be moderated by my friend Justin here. Justin is also with Wefunder, but he understands the space a little better than I do. So I invited him to interview Nick here on the topic of everything you need to know to raise equity crowdfunding. And Nick, in his spare time,
yeah, I don't have much spare time. For me, it's either I'm working every hour of the day or traveling. So I just got back from Iceland and Paris for about 10 days. First trip in almost a year and a half because of COVID. And it was just nice to get out in the world again.
You know what? One lesson from you I learned in the last 5 minutes is as founders, we don't have a separate life for work and separate life for personal. And so it's all intertwined. And you've done a great thing by making your home and office in that great mansion in San Francisco. So your lifestyle is good.
Just double down on the no boundaries thing, man. I just wake up and there's my desk right in front of me to get to work.
It's beautiful. We're going to hang out. And then Justin is going to moderate the session in his spare time. Justin owns a boat charter service. And, that's super interesting. Did you get that funded by Wefunder too?
I didn't. I actually got it funded on Indiegogo when I first started. So I started in the early days of crowdfunding at Kiva and fundraised for my business on Kiva and Indiegogo.
Awesome. Justin and Nick, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Lloyd. We really appreciate being here. And it's great to see so many people joining. It's a pleasure to be here and interview Nick. Nick is our CEO. I'm the head of partnerships at Wefunder. So this is a unique one for us that we're really, really excited about. Nick, let's just start at the top line. Can you just tell us what is equity crowdfunding and how do you see Wefunder's role in this space?
Yeah, I think equity crowdfunding is just kind of a very big word. What it really means is just getting lots of investors who care about your product to invest and give you small amounts of money. Typically, a company that raises about $5 million will have about 5,000 investors who are their most passionate customers. And so we're just basically making millions of new angel investors who actually angel invest on Wefunder.
And what is Wefunder's role in the spectrum of equity crowdfunding? How do you see our role in this kind of enablement of massive amounts of investors coming in and helping companies?
It's mostly around creating the industry. We started a decade ago and we're very involved in the initial legislation with Congress. And then the last 6 years, lots of conversations with the SEC and FINRA, our regulators, to basically pioneer how this actually can work in practice to be good for both investors and founders. And since the law is not very black and white, but lots of shades of gray, it's about how to pioneer to actually make this workable and actually evolve those regulations over time to support that.
When we think about the value that investors can bring to companies, a lot of times we think about angels and VCs bringing institutional knowledge and connections and Rolodex of that benefit the founder. How do you see the pros and cons of having 5,000 investors participate in your round? What are the kind of nuances around that that may be compelling or a challenge for a company that's exploring equity crowdfunding?
Yeah, and like I guess taking a step back, I've never advocated, even in the early days, that we're going to replace venture capital. Like if Sequoia gives you a term sheet, you probably want Sequoia on their cap table. Like, of course, take their money. More value there from like, very elite connections and strategy advice. But I would say like also reserve a small part of your round to raise from your customers and most passionate fans. And the value I say there is more about like increasing your Lux surface area. The more people who care about what you do, who are passionate about, and who are like literally, not just emotionally, but literally invested in it, is more likely that lucky things will happen. For a tech startup, it might just be a good asset for recruiting. Like if you need an engineer or a designer or a key hire, and you have 5,000 investors who probably together have a pretty good Rolodex, you might be exposed to a lot more people who might want to join your company. If you're a brewery raising money on Wefunder and your customers have invested, they're probably going to drink more beer and tell their friends about it. For Wefunder too, like our investors also send us like deals, customers. And so for us having 5,000 investors who are like interested and incentivized to actually always refer us companies to launch on Wefunder, I think is a pretty big advantage. So yeah, I don't really see it as mutually exclusive, like, raise from VC or raise on Wefunder. I say use both. And then at the earlier stages, let's say, raising between, $1 and $5 million, I think it just allows you to have more leverage. You don't have to raise from VCs. You can raise from people who actually understand intuitively what you're doing because you're your customers. And that lets you get more traction and more progress, which may mean that you might effectively raise a Series B from a VC instead of the Series A. I know some founders have done a very good job of rejecting a bad term sheet under bad terms, using Wefunder to basically get another year of progress and then raise on good terms later.
When I first joined Wefunder 2 years ago, I joined at a time when the growth was relatively flat, and a big topic of conversation was product market fit. And for the first 6 months at Wefunder, we talked a lot about just what can we do to find product market fit. Not to mention, you started in 2012, so you had already been working through the product market fit question for a long period of time. And over the last 18 months, we've just seen a spike in our core business. There's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of activity, and a lot of eyeballs on the equity crowdfunding space right now. What are your insights, and what do you feel are the main inputs that have catalyzed that growth over the past 18 months?
Yeah, it's all regulation. When I first started, like almost a decade ago now, it was like convince Congress to pass law. The next 5 years was convince SEC to make common sense regulations that are workable in the real world. The first draft of these regulations were issued in 2016, and honestly, they kind of sucked. So our pitch to a founder back in 2016 was, hey, use Wefunder. You're going to have 5,000 investors directly on your cap table, but don't worry about it. And there's this fear of needing to collect lots of signatures to authorize your follow-on financing. It's also this weird new thing that's never been done before. Combined with, if you have more than $25 million in assets and more than 2,000 investors, you might be forced to go public. So anyway, very horrible pitch. Combined with, you must do CPA reviewed GAAP accounting before you even realize anybody wants to invest in you. So from 2016 to 2020, like there's a subset of companies that really cared about crowdfunding, that could research all these things and feel pretty comfortable with it. But most founders are like, fuck, that sounds complicated. No thanks. I'll use my backup to my backup to my backup to my backup plan. Now, the laws were reformed just a few months ago and fixed almost all these problems. Right now, all investors are only one entity on your cap table. There's only one person that a founder picks to sign off any follow-on financing documents. There's no more any ambiguity that you would be forced to go public. There's a lot more legitimate companies that have used crowdfunding under these new laws to kind of pave the way for smaller companies that it's more of a safe option. And there's now an ability to, within 10 minutes, start collecting reservations from potential investors before you decide to do your accounting work, which is generally not that big of a deal. It's just a distraction that is best avoided until you know for sure it's going to work. And those three reforms combined have, in my mind, like what I envisioned 10 years ago, took about 10 years to actually work in practice.
And talk about your journey. I know that you spend a lot of time on the regulatory piece. You've got contacts at the SEC. You were involved in bringing this law to fruition. Kind of like, what does it look like practically in trying to navigate the regulatory environment? And talk a little bit more about what happened on March 15th and how it's impacted the trajectory of our core business.
Yeah. Okay. So first, the regulatory question. I guess before I answer your question directly, to me, it's actually kind of inspiring that someone with no reputation or credentials can kind of go to Washington, D.C. and knock on a few doors and actually have like senators and congressmen and the president's office actually like listen to me. So back in 2012, we played this small part in helping broker a compromise between like the Democrats and Republicans, where the GOP had this 2-page law that was complete Wild West, anybody can do anything. And the Democrats had this like 60-page law that was just so complicated that it just would never work. And they kind of met in the middle. And like, well, I guess what I learned from that initial process was like, if you show up and know what you're talking about, the staffers behind the scenes are happy to talk to you and pick your brain and get advice and actually change the actual legislation. And the staffers are the ones that have the power because they're the lawyers who understand this inside out. And for most of these issues, it's like the details that actually matter. Then when we moved on to kind of the SEC front, I guess what I learned there is that the SEC is a very big organization with a lot of different viewpoints, but these are people who really tried to get it right. I think there's a lot of fear that the SEC is just going to screw it up like on purpose, but they really have to balance two mandates, like how do you actually facilitate capital formation to actually give money to businesses, and of course, how to protect investors. And these opposing views within the agency can cause like conflict, obviously. And I found my best use there was how to explain how things would work in the real world. For instance, with single purpose vehicles, which is the mechanism how to group all these investors into one entity in the cap table, on one level sounds kind of scary to someone worried about investor protections, like, oh, the investors don't get the same rights. But in the real world, if there is no SPV option, only the worst companies would use crowdfunding, and any securities they issue would have no voting rights and be on inferior terms. So basically, it's like taking a lot of issues like this and making a lot of conversations explaining how the market would respond to the regulations and how to best make the regulations actually work in practice to kind of fulfill their two goals. Then I forget your second question.
The second question was, there was a huge wave of regulations that got rolled out in March. Mm-hmm. That fundamentally shifted the core operations of our business, and with testing the waters, re-architecting the founder onboarding flow, rethinking how investors can participate earlier in the raise. Can you talk a little bit about what happened on March 15th and how we kind of made decisions around those regulations to make this more founder friendly and to streamline the process by which founders could participate in this?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, those regulations were things we've been like asking for about 8 years. The two biggest ones being SPVs, which is one ending the cap table, and the other one being known as testing the waters, which is basically allowing you to fundraise within 10 minutes. And I kind of knew what like a huge deal this was. And we had basically about a 3 month heads up to basically completely redo our entire product and almost every operational process that we had within 3 months, with largely like, half the team not having quite the context, not even understand why we're doing these things. But with the imperative that we had to move very, very, very fast because there was a deadline set by law that we had to have it all work by. So basically, we kind of like blew like everything up. The people with a lot of context were literally just spending every hour of their day just like executing without really communicating what was happening, combined with like where everybody was accustomed to just changing pretty much overnight. So quite a lot of chaos. But on the other hand, I was just quite proud of the resilience and adaptability of the team to like, just like roll the punches. And like we just did, a huge, probably did 2 years of work in 3 months. It was like incredibly inspirational. And then, it was March 15th, that date actually happened. We launched, and we just saw it working. On the other hand, a lot of fires because like there's a lot of things happening all at once, but it actually changed the game. We've 10x investments over the same period a year ago, like huge inflection of growth. I mean, pretty much now just on the like rapidly expanding the team so we can keep up with this growth. And obviously because of those regulatory reforms, right now I see a relatively easy path for us to grow into like $1 billion company in a relatively short order. Just doing what we're doing and just streamlining our operations and scaling up. And now my major focus is how do we get to that next level beyond that? And for that, what I would say is that right now we finally have the regulations we need, and we have a pretty good product that can move lots of money from point A to point B affordably. But the next big thing for us is how do we make that money more valuable so that when a founder raises on Wefunder, they don't just get $5 million. We actually build a product that actually encourages their 5,000 investors to want to help them in any way that they want to be helped, or the product that puts you in a network of thousands of other investors who also raise on Wefunder that can give you like specific tactical advice on whatever your challenge is. And they've been there and done that also. And also that's probably our main focus next year.
And what is that? How does that translate practically into the product in terms of deepening that engagement that investors have with founders, and how you design the strategy of Wefunder to enable that?
Yeah, it's a hard challenge. Well, taking a step back, right now our project is mostly focused on helping the person make the investment, and then the investor makes the investment, and then it's kind of like a black box. Like they don't know what's happening, they don't hear back. Maybe like once a year they'll get some update from the founder. Founders obviously are really, really busy, and they only do things that are valuable to their business, and they probably don't want to spend a huge amount of time answering questions from 5,000 investors and spending a lot of time writing updates. And so for me, the product challenge is how do we make it obvious that these investors can offer value so a founder can prioritize keeping them engaged and justify spending some time at least once a quarter and maybe once a month, giving them an update, asking them for help and actually getting that help. It's also around like as an investor, in Silicon Valley, we kind of take what being an angel investor means for granted, but a lot of this country has been not really exposed to it. And I would say the best investors also want to figure out how they can be helpful so they can increase their brand and get access to better deals. So how do we like educate, someone who just made $100 investment in Boise for the first time that, hey, if you want to take this seriously and make 10 investments, you should like think of yourself as an angel investor, have it part of your identity, have like a page that shows what your portfolio is, what you've been helpful on, things you've done on the platform to help your company succeed. Maybe there's a way for you, if you do this, to get access to better deals that are more exclusive on the Wefunder platform. There's like a lot of things that go into those two broad areas.
And Wefunder raised the full 5 million. We launched on March 15th with the new regulations. How has that kind of transcribed itself practically for Wefunder as a company? You know, a lot of times equity crowdfunding is kind of perceived as a this is a consumer facing play. This is a good thing for consumer facing businesses, converting customers to investors, bringing in new investors, converting them to customers. For a company like Wefunder and the 5,000 investors that we have, how have you kind of teased out that conceptual framework for Wefunder itself? And can you talk a little bit about the $5 million raise that we executed earlier this year?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is like nothing new. Wefunder has raised on Wefunder since 2012. Wefunder was the first company on Wefunder in 2012, go figure. And I kind of knew I was on the right path when Wefunder raised our first $500,000 pre-seed round in 2012. And we just sent an email out to our mailing list, and then random people like in Europe and China, all over the world, like invested. That eureka moment when some guy in Belgium puts in $15,000 into my company with nothing, without even talking to me, I was like, holy shit. And then, you know, every year since then, we've also raised on Wefunder. At that time, because of the laws, we did it through accredited investors. So the only thing that was new that we did this year was allow anybody to invest, even if they weren't unaccredited. And then it's like, at that point, it wasn't really much of a surprise to me. Like, it was pretty obvious that companies with engaged, passionate fans raise money very easily. And so we sent out an email to the Wefunder registered base, and within a day, we raised like $3 million. And then we sent out another email, and then very quickly we had $5 million. So basically, I sent out 2 emails and got $5 million, and it was kind of cool.
Easy, easy. What, you know, the raising on Reg D from accredited investors, you know, through the course of the Wefunder history is different than executing a regulation crowdfund, opening this up to unaccredited investors. What were some of the learnings and insights you had in actually going through the regulatory process and filing the Form C to unlock the Reg CF campaign that allowed unaccredited investors to finally participate in the Wefunder raise?
Yeah, I guess I didn't learn much because I've filed like 300 Form Cs over the last 4 years. So from my standpoint, it was like, okay, we need to do GAAP financials. Suze, who's our head of ops, please give me our GAAP financials. And then Suze talked to the accountant, and then we had GAAP financials, and then we had $5 million.
If only it was that easy in practice.
Well, it really isn't that hard. I mean, like, what's a Form C? It's like, who are your corporate directors? Who are your officers? Who owns more than 20% of your company? What are your biggest risks? What classes of shares do you have? And then it's your accounting. The hardest part of the Form C is your 2 years of GAAP accounting, which isn't that hard. It just costs usually a couple $1,000s and takes a couple of weeks for the accountant to put together. And then the accountant will ask some annoying questions like, hey, this transaction a year and a half ago, like, what is this? And like, I don't fucking know, it was a year and a half ago. And then you go and figure it out. And so it might add like 5 hours of distraction to the founder to like track down some like old transactions and make sure they're reconciled properly. But in general, if you do that, then you get $5 million. And so it's kind of nice.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I think one of the biggest differentiators in the scope of, hey, there's a few major players in the equity crowdfunding space. Wefunder is one of them. I get asked all the time on the partnerships team, how do you differentiate from the other kind of platforms that are doing this? And one thing I always kind of point to is the fact that we're a public benefit corporation. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to set us up as a PBC, and what are the implications in how you make business decisions under that kind of umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it doesn't change anything at all. The reason we're a public benefit corporation is that is the way that I think companies should be run. and the way companies were commonly understood to be run for almost all of history until about 30 years ago. I think over the last 30 years, there's been more of this narrative that has encouraged lots of companies to focus on short-term results, with the only stakeholder mattering being your investors. And I personally think that actually leads to outcomes that make less money for investors, where if all you do is focus on quarterly earnings targets for your investors, you're probably going to miss out on like the big picture in a 10-year time frame. So to me, the public benefit corporation is a symbol of what we stand for. So partly when we recruit new people, they understand why Wefunder exists and what we think is important. On the other hand, though, it's a symbol of we are thinking for the long term. If we deliver on this mission, we are actually going to make a lot more money because we're going to offer a lot more value to both founders and investors, which will pay huge dividends. And it's just a statement for potential new employees and also investors, so that they understand like how we operate. And like, I don't know, like I personally think that, for instance, Google and Amazon have done a similar thing where they, think long term, and they're not a PBC. So you don't have to be a PBC in order to do this. But to me, it's just an easy symbol to make sure that no one is confused how we operate.
You said it's a clear stake in the ground as to what we stand for. Can you articulate what we stand for?
Yeah, I say one North Star is doing the right thing, even if it's hard. Doing right by founders and doing right by investors.
What does that mean practically?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. With a marketplace that has investors and founders, you can think of several things that can like help one but help the other. Oh, here's a specific one. Okay, if I wanted to dramatically increase all short-term metrics, I would redo all of our branding to basically harness the emotion of greed and missing out. It would be like, invest in the next unicorn, otherwise like you're going to miss out on being rich. And some of our competitors have done this. And we do the opposite. We're like, hey, investing in startups is risky. Don't invest more than you can afford to lose. You're probably going to lose all your money. If you want to invest in a startup, you should do it for another reason beyond just making money. Like, of course you want to make money, but do it because you care about the cause, you care about this problem, you care about this person. And even if you lose the money, you should still feel like you've given back and you helped this founder take their shot. And when you're investing a few $100s, people are allowed to do that. If you're a VC investing $10 million, you're not allowed to do that. But with your own money, $100, you can use things beyond just making money as a criteria of your investment. And so this, in some ways, probably hurts some of our short-term metrics. But for me, it's like, it's far more important for every investor to understand what they are getting into, to basically recruit the kind of investor we want, which leads to a better experience both for the investors that we get, so they're not misled in a few years, and actually a better experience for the founders, where if our brand is all about helping out the companies that you invest in, like vote with your dollars on what our society should invest in, then we're probably gonna have less crazy investors like, upset and like horrified when they eventually lose money because the company, despite their best efforts, failed.
Love that. Can you talk a little bit? I'd like to talk a little bit specifically about a few use cases. Could you talk about a founder or a company that executed a campaign on Wefunder that kind of idealized what Wefunder is all about, and it's an articulation of like, this is why we're doing this, and this is Wefunder in its best example?
Yeah, there's probably a few categories of that. One category, which is the company that is growing fast and that decides, because they care, to allow their fans to have the same terms as the venture capitalists. That's democratizing access to really good companies. And the cool thing about that class of companies is that they can raise money like in a day, like basically all their fans very quickly investing in them. So a few categories of that. We had Rome Research raise like $6.7 million in a day about a month ago. And people who use Rome really, really love it. And they also got to invest on the same terms as some of the best angel investors in Silicon Valley. Another one in that class, which a couple of years ago, is Meow Wolf, which are these crazy like 200 artists in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that created this like psychedelic like art installation, and then like got like $6 million in ticket sales like the first like year, and now have since raised like a few $100 million to expand across the country. Also raised $1 million in a day, which back then was kind of the limit you're allowed to raise. So that's like a good example of companies that have passionate fans that those fans previously would have been shut out of kind of like good investments, now get to participate in it. There's another class of companies that are doing something hard, and doing it like hard and long term that venture capitalists are less inclined to support, but actually like really matter. And one example of that, I think, is Leah Labs. They're a YC company curing cancer in dogs that had a tough time after YC Demo Day raising money. They raised like, maybe like $500,000. And VCs are like, curing cancer, kind of risky. Sounds like a research project. Good luck. That raised also $1 million on Wefunder from people who just like realized that, it's risky, curing cancer, like it's hard, but like a few $100s to help these three like brilliant people tackle this problem is probably a good use of my money. Also a good example. Things that are like aspirational that people just want to support. And then one thing that is right now not the sweet spot for crowdfunding, but which I find personally fulfilling and which I hope over the long term becomes more and more powerful for us, are like idea stage founders who have like nothing other than like an idea, and people who care about them, who can like, in 10 minutes set up like, a profile on Wefunder describing what they want to do, and then raise like their first 50 grand from their actual friends who know them, who want to support them, which is probably the riskiest possible investment to make. But the idea of like your friends who believe in you and back up that belief with money, to me is like really fucking cool. And we have a few of those stories. Like there's one friend of mine actually that raised like the first like, $50,000 on Wefunder to try to reconceptualize like 3D machining. And has since raised another $1 million after that. But seeing him get started on Wefunder to me was pretty fulfilling.
Love that. I think that one thing that I've seen practically in working with a lot of campaigns is this hybrid effect where it's like, hey, we can bring in the VCs, we can bring in our passionate communities. There's more pools to fish out of. And this just extends opportunity beyond, it's just like, hey, we can get our passionate fans involved. We can also get our VCs involved. And it is a mixing pot of different stakeholders coming into the equation, many of whom can add different types of value. So, if you were to look at those three categorical pieces, three categories of companies, I think that a lot of times it's a blend of all three for a lot of the companies that participate on Wefunder. Is like, hey, we want to bring in our passionate friends. Hey, we've got our community, friends and family that are participating in us. And this is an opportunity to bring in investors all under the same umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the most sophisticated founders intuitively understand that. Where, I mean, it depends on the stage of the company, but if you're raising your first $2 million, the founder should close that $2 million as fast as possible. Some founders are in the position where it's like they make a few phone calls and like their rich buddies give them $2 million and like they're done in like a week. That happens. That's like really, really fucking rare. And so I think the best founders who don't have that kind of like network can run down multiple paths simultaneously. They can use Wefunder while talking to angels, while talking to some seed stage VCs. And then the best founders can basically maximize FOMO, where it's like, you have been like talking to me for like 3 months. It is time to invest. If you don't invest, like we're done because I'm moving on. And you can play both sides off each other. It's like investors on Wefunder are more likely to invest if you've closed a very good lead investor who has a reputation, because they feel a little more safe that some adult in the room is looking at the details of the deal. And traditional angel investors and who invest professionally are much more likely to get off the fence and actually make the investment if they see a progress bar on Wefunder raising very fast. And so by harnessing all that momentum on one day and getting that first day pop, generally people will get off the fence and actually make the fucking investment, which is what you want as a founder raising a seed round.
That's one big differentiator with Wefunder is we require all companies to select a lead investor that all of the crowd gets pulled into on the SPV. What's an important kind of, how do you see the role of the lead investor, and what should founders consider when figuring out who that lead investor should be? Because it is a big role if you have $5 million coming in that's being pulled into one lead. What are those considerations, and how do you see the role of the lead investor in our ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things to balance. One, this is the person that's going to sign off any future documents, like to authorize like a future financing and to like maybe a consent to an acquisition or to increase the stock option pool. And then the other criteria is like which person can you pick that is well known, that has good signaling factor to other investors they actually do invest. And I would say which one to rank more highly is going to depend on how much money you want to raise. If you're only raising $250,000 on Wefunder of like a $3 million round, it's nice to have like an investor that you really trust, understands what the mission of the company is, and who you basically just trust gets it and is sophisticated and is like, has a good track record as an investor and has been helpful to founders, and maybe maximize like signaling factor. Maybe it's somebody you don't know as well, but is very famous. But if you're raising $5 million and one investor gets to vote for $5 million, I would probably do the opposite and maximize the ability of picking someone that I would trust as much as a VC partner. Even if there's no board seat, and there's probably not a board seat, but if there is, I would treat them like they had a board seat. And like, do I want to work with this person?
To kind of snowball on that, there's a lot of founders on this call right now. I'd be curious to get your insights on the most important considerations for a founder exploring equity crowdfunding as a potential route to raise capital. What should they be thinking about? What kind of research should they do? What are the different pieces to evaluate fit on whether this is the right funding vehicle for them?
Yeah, it's a very vague question because it depends. I would say crowdfunding can fit in most companies with most goals. So basically, I'm trying to rephrase your question as like, why should I not use crowdfunding?
Sure.
You probably should not use crowdfunding if you've already lined up $2 million in your $2 million seed rounds, and you don't need it, obviously. I say a lot of founders think they can do that in like a week. It ends up taking like 5 months. And so like if you do think you're that, you should actually make sure you're that. Otherwise, like there's no real downside to letting your fans and customers invest. It's really just one tool in your playbook. It's like if you want to raise your first $2 million, maybe you're a B2B company, and a B2B company might be less of a fit on Wefunder because you don't really have lots of customers who want to invest. That said, Wefunder does have like 1 million investors who do invest in B2B companies. It might not be the sweet spot. So it might make sense to spend 10 minutes to have a profile on Wefunder, and people can follow that campaign, and maybe you'll raise like a few $100,000 and then just collect it in addition to your $1.5 million you get traditionally. Maybe it'll work better than you expect. Maybe it won't work at all, but it's a very small investment of time to try.
I know that Lloyd has a very big following in Canada. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A about Canadian companies and Canadian investors. Can you talk a little bit about the regulatory environment outside of the US on the founder and the investor side, specifically to Canada?
Yeah, Wefunder only supports raises in the United States. That's one of the provisions of the crowdfunding law. So we only can help US entities actually raise money. We are going to expand to Europe by the end of the year. So we'll have a European option of all. Anybody in the European Union will be able to raise on Wefunder. I am not familiar with the Canadian ecosystem. Unfortunately, of the entire world, only 3 provinces in Canada have requested that we don't allow their investors to invest. So residents of Alberta, Quebec, and one on Ontario are not allowed to invest on Wefunder,
No,
unfortunately.
this is a, sorry, I'm butting in here. About like, I think we got about 110,000+ subscribers. 40,000 of those are in Canada. Right, Boast has huge presence in Canada, so a lot of our subscribers are there, and it makes me sad that, you know, they're saying don't invest on Wefunder. Now I see another flip side, right? Like when you compare companies that are raising from venture, when you go to venture capitalists and go to raise money as a foreign company, they almost always ask you to set up a Delaware C corp, right? Set up a Delaware C corp, and set up an entity where the Canadian is a sub, or like partially owned by Canadian, sort of Canadians, and then partially owned by the Delaware Sea, so they can still maintain a Canadian controlled status. What are the requirements for being a US company to be on Wefunder? Because effectively, it seems like I can go and register a Del C and fund that company through Wefunder, right?
Yeah, I am not a lawyer, so I don't know the exact mechanics, but I do know that many companies have done that process on Wefunder. And the thing you didn't mention is that it also allows those companies to take advantage of the Canadian tax perks. I know they get a bunch of money if they hire employees, for instance.
Yeah, so like you can do something on the cuffs, right? Like where you have a 2-entity setup. I'm not a lawyer either, so don't take this as legal advice here. But I've seen a lot of companies. Like yesterday, I was speaking with somebody from Montreal I was on a webinar with Wefunder yesterday talking about R&D tax credits, and talked to a Montreal company, and it seemed like they were funding through Wefunder Blossom.
Yeah, so it is possible. It's more complicated. You got to do a lot of like legal shuffling. But to your point, that you might want to do that anyway, because when you eventually grow to raise money from venture capitalists, they're still going to want you to do that. So it just forces founders, if they want to use Wefunder, to do it probably earlier than they would otherwise do it.
One from Sean Allen. Do you see trends occurring on Wefunder in terms of the types of companies that are using it, or the use case for companies kind of exploring equity crowdfunding?
Yeah, I mean, the sweet spots, which I mentioned previously, is companies with huge fan bases who have customers who really care what they're doing. Definitely a sweet spot for us. Companies that are aspirational, like tackling like climate change, space, like hard tech, do very, very well in Wefunder. And companies that are growing fast and making money also do very, very well in Wefunder. In terms of industries, we're incredibly diverse. We raise everything from like, the first 50 grand in a coffee shop to like, curing cancer in dogs. Like it's like it runs the entire gamut. And there's definitely been data that we've seen that our investors like investing in both of those things. Like the overlap between an investor investing in their local brewery and investing in like, a space satellite is like a lot more overlapping than people think. So I would say it's more about like the emotional edge, like really investing in things they care about, investing in what they know already, more than the actual industry that matters. Anecdotally, it seems like it's like a third like tech startup, a third like Main Street, and like a third like kind of in the middle. They're like Meow Wolf. It's like not a tech startup, but they're a pretty significant company that's like raised hundreds of millions of dollars, like in the middle hybrid.
And a kind of follow on to this from Mark. Mark says, what are the kind of industry trends upstream from VCs and angels kind of evaluating equity crowdfunding along that timeline, and kind of the shift in perspective of equity crowdfunding from institutional investors down upstream?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I think there's like a large lack of awareness, actually. More specifically, from 2016 to 2020, for people who were aware, there was probably some feeling of adverse selection and stigma because the laws were so bad that, as a pool, generally companies that had no other option would do it. With the new laws, that has now changed. Now we've actually seen companies that are very significant with billion-dollar valuations actually use and decide to use Wefunder. And so I would say that, 3 months ago, the underlying route changed to take care of that adverse selection problem. And I would say in one more year, it will be obvious that we funded significantly good companies, that perception actually will change and no longer will be a stigma. What we need to evolve towards is to make it so that if you raise on Wefunder, that should be a mark of prestige. Like if you actually have a product that your customers want to invest in, like that should be a signal of quality. And I'll say we're not quite there yet, but we're moving that direction.
For sure, for sure. And what are kind of in I think that's an important piece of the equation, getting companies to access follow-on financing, seeing acquisitions, seeing exits, getting our investors paid on these investments. What's your perspective of that timeline and that process of getting founders, seeing founders through that full cycle? Obviously, it takes a long time. This is early stage investing. What's your take on the kind of the long-term kind of process for founders post Wefunder, down the line?
Yeah, I mean, relatively quickly, we can see unrealized returns where when a company raises their seed round on Wefunder and then raises at $1 billion valuation from a VC, we can very easily show that there's been progress that's been made. An actual exit is counterintuitive, where the best companies will take 10 years. And so Wefunder raised money for several unicorns in 2013. And only now, 7 years later, has our first one gone actually public, and the others still haven't gone public. And so there actually has been no return to investors yet. The way I've described it is more like a socially good lottery ticket, where you make investments and either in 10 years, you're gonna have like 1,000x return, or you're gonna make nothing, like very binary. All that said, one thing we haven't touched on is that there should be a secondary market on Wefunder itself. And I would guess within 3 to 4 years, where the law allows people to be able to trade securities after 1 year. And I would say that after we funded several unicorns on seed rounds, there was a lot of investor demand to actually trade those securities. And we're basically moving towards having a long-term secondary market where founders can open up a trading window every 9 to 18 months alongside their traditional venture capital raising to allow some liquidity to their investors.
Yeah. And we're starting to see more and more ecosystem players tangential to, the private investing space that are starting to have these conversations. With the growth of the industry, you're seeing a lot of interesting developments around marketing, around liquidation, around kind of angel investing hybrids on Wefunder, facilitated practically. It's a really exciting space with all of these new kind of perspectives of equity crowdfunding. Do you have any what kind of external organization are you really excited about that is kind of complementing and compounding the impact that Wefunder can create?
I don't know, maybe I'm just too arrogant, but if I cared about it, I would do it in-house.
Well, I think a good example is the regulatory piece, just like making it more founder friendly, having influence on the laws that make it.
In the past, we've done that. Well, literally, I did that. But I've never worked with a third party to do that. It was so important to the company that I myself went to Washington, D.C. And there's like all these third party organizations that were like helping lobby the law, but I just thought they were incompetent, and I'd rather do it myself because it's the most critical thing for the company was getting that right.
Right, for sure. To shift gears a little bit, can you talk about the onboarding process? With testing the waters being released in March and allowing companies to fundraise much quicker, what does that look like practically for a founder that's looking to execute a campaign? And what is your kind of like, what are you seeing practically in terms of how companies are getting onboarded onto Wefunder and what that experience looks like?
Yeah. With the old laws, if you wanted to use Wefunder, you would need to wait like 3 to 4 weeks for your accounting to finish up a bunch of accounting. And only then actually create a profile on Wefunder and actually ask if people actually want to invest. With these new laws, it's like you upload like a slide deck and maybe like a 2-minute video of you talking to an iPhone. And then you can immediately send that around to people and actually get them to make reservations to say they would invest, and actually get to see them if they actually also like put money in their Wefunder account to back up their reservation. So it allows you basically to make sure you're not wasting your time. Instead of betting a month, you can basically just take your slide deck you already have, upload to Wefunder, send a link around, actually get reservations, and then decide if you want to like go work with the accountant to finish up your accounting. So this takes all the friction out. It's just much more of a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been the biggest driver of our growth. When you look at the amount of reservations that are coming in on a month-to-month basis, it's been the source of our growth over the past 4 to 5 months.
Yeah. I mean, our growth has always been dependent upon the number of quality companies that decide to launch campaigns. And this law just took it from companies needing to spend a month to like spending 10 minutes. And so we have a lot more companies using it, which results in a lot of growth for us.
Right. And a lot more operational friction.
Yeah, well, that's our job to handle. Yeah, my full-time job right now is recruiting, so we can like keep up the demand.
Other than recruiting and building out the team, do you have other kind of key priorities over the next 6 months? We're almost we just passed the halfway point of the year. What are the things that you're kind of most focused on as the CEO?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, for the next 6 months, I think most of my job is going to be basically doubling our headcount, reorganizing the company, making sure that each team knows exactly what they need to do. A lot of like onboarding and recruiting. What I hope to be is that by the end of the year, have a fully functional product team that is properly resourced, so that next year I can focus more on the community of what Wefunder is. Like after you make an investment, it should feel like an investor is part of the community. There's ways they can give back. There's ways they can build their identity. But I think this year is mostly going to be preparing for that year. Right now, we're just dramatically under-resourced. Most of our competitors are already double our size, and we do more investments than each of them with like less resources. And to an extent, that is very, very useful. I think resource constraints actually are good, but we've definitely overdone it.
I think a good note to end on is this notion of community. Lloyd's obviously built an awesome community here through the Traction umbrella. I think that I'm inspired by what you've done, Lloyd. Nick, in terms of community, we have a huge house in San Francisco. We hold a lot of events, but when I think about community, the real heart and soul of Wefunder is the XX. Obviously we came out of Y Combinator, 8-9 years ago. And your vision and execution around the XX has been very inspiring to me. Can you talk a little bit about the XX and kind of what that is? This is kind of a pet project of Wefunder that's had just amazing results over the past couple of years. Something that I think everybody internally is really, really excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the XX is a little bit like what YC was like, 10, 15 years ago, where you take like, people with no experience who have nothing, and then within 3 months, through a ruthless focus on building product and talking to users and iterating as fast as possible, get them into a state where they can get funded, and then demo days basically on Wefunder. And so we have a network of lots of founders who've been there and done that with billion-dollar exits who want to pay it forward and help these founders actually progress very fast. And we've done it on a pretty small scale. We do like 4 batches this year. Each batch has like maybe like 10 companies. But like for me, the vision of that is, how do we productize that? How can we make Wefunder itself encourage lots of mini XXs across the country and across the world, so that more experienced founders can actually put early stage founders in an environment where they can make massive progress in only 3 months, where I think most earlier stage founders with little experience spend a lot of time doing the wrong things because some advisor in like their local city wants them to get a patent, for instance, where it's like ruthless focus and execution is what's needed.
I think the XX is something I'm deeply inspired by. It points to community. It points to our our stake around being a public benefit corporation. It points to what we stand for, and it's going to be a big part of our identity, especially as we have those opportunities to invest in community in 2022 and beyond. Nick, I wanted to thank you for your time. Thank you very much. This was very fun for me to be able to participate in this way. Lloyd, thank you for hosting us. It has been awesome. I hope it was valuable for the participants, and wish all the founders on the call, if you'd be interested in raising on Wefunder, it's wefunder.com/raise. You can also feel free to add me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Nick, thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Hey, thanks, guys. Have a good one, and stay tuned for our sessions. We have a great lineup coming up next week and the week after. So stay tuned. Go to tractionconf.io or boast.ai/events. Have a good one. Love and peace.